Okay, guys, hello. Let's see if I can get all this in here. Just do my computer here so I can get this equation there. Almost time. Yeah. All right, perfect. Look at that. So if I rush through any of this, it's because I've made this video at least like 3 times now, and people keep interrupting me, and I have to start all over. So that is kind of the many times that I've given this already is a lot for me. So I'm just going to go straight to acid-base balance here, and we're going to talk about acids and bases and the disorders involved in that. So acid is any substance that ionizes in water to produce a proton. A base is something that will absorb that proton if one is around. So that's the basis. That's the basic of that, and we're going to talk about buffering in a second. That is kind of the basis of how that all works. So why do we need acid-base regulation? So the body maintains a pH of 7.4, and it actually maintains that in a normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. That's a very narrow range that the body regulates that. And the reason is because it's very important, because slightly acidic or slightly basic really messes with all the processes in our body. And one of the big ones are your function of your enzymes that can't work properly. Just like they can't work in elevated temperatures, they also can't work when it's really acidic or really basic. Other ones are going to be, it does cause shifts of ions, so that can cause some problems. The hormones, a lot of hormones are going to be affected by that, and so that's going to be, of course, all your body processes. And our favorite friend, the neurons, who are sensitive to everything, so surprise, surprise, they're going to be sensitive to acid-base balance as well. And that's a big deal. They even have their own separate system within the cerebrospinal fluid that regulates that. So, as we're going to talk about with acid-base disorders, they're going to notice that I'm going to talk so much more about acidoses as opposed to alkaloses, and that is because there's always a source of acid being produced in the body. So we always have to have a way to deal with that. And so this is the sources of acid in your body are going to be, so the first one is the most common one, is the aerobic respiration of glucose. So if you remember this from the respiratory system, and our little friend right here, is that carbon dioxide is always going to be produced, and that's the product of the aerobic, so respiration of glucose. So when you have oxygen around, then your cells are going to process your glucose from the glycolysis to the citric acid cycle to the electron transport chain, get all your ATPs out. Carbon dioxide just happens to be a byproduct of that. And so if you remember all the ways that carbon dioxide is transported in the blood, then you will remember this guy. So this guy so we have carbon dioxide, and when it'll combine with water to, my screen just went blank, sorry guys. It'll combine with water by carbonic anhydrase. So this is the enzyme that does this reaction. So remember, this happens in the red blood cells, and that's going to give you carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. So look at that, carbonic acid, so it's an acid. And so it'll naturally dissociate into your proton and bicarb. And so this is the essence. That's why it's an acid. It's not a super strong acid, but it is one, and so that's your source of proton in your body. And so these are also post-reversible equations, as you remember in respiratory and the red blood cells. When you get to the lungs, this goes back and you get the CO2 released, and then it's exhaled. And so this is your main source of acid in your body. There's also the anaerobic respiration of glucose, so when you don't have oxygen present. Big prime example of that's going to be like when you're working out, lifting weights, your muscles are working really, really hard, and there's just not enough oxygen available to get to them quickly enough, and so they'll undergo glycolysis and not go to the citric acid cycle and electron transport chain that require oxygen. And so as a result of that, they're going to produce the pyruvate, which will be converted into lactic acid. And so that is a source of acid too. And so that can be a big deal also in animals, for example, that aren't typically able to take in oxygen. All these other ones, incomplete oxidation of fatty acids, so you can get that from the rapid breakdown of fat, lose fatty acids, and the liver converts those into ketone bodies, which are also acids. So it's a ketoacidosis. And so that sounds familiar. Some of you guys have heard of it, which is diabetic ketoacidosis. And that is a little bit of a different story, in that when you have a lot of glucose in your blood, the liver tries to deal with that. The liver tries to take that glucose out, tries to help out. But when there's too much, it's going to start converting that into ketone bodies, and that is where you get diabetic ketoacidosis. And then these other ones, so sulfur-containing amino acids, and these last 4 and 5, I don't know, I don't know that much about them, and so they're not really that important. So, regulation of pH. So we're always producing all this acid, right? Especially from the aerobic respiration of glucose. Always this source right here. So how do we deal with that? How does the body deal with that? Okay, and there's lots of ways. So there are 4 basic methods. That's the buffers, the respiratory center, the kidneys, and also the diet. We won't really talk much about the diet. So the buffer system is something that happens super duper quick, right? Because if you have acid coming in, and these buffers are just going to be able to take up that proton right away. So you think about when I get to this side, and we have bicarb floating around in our system, so whenever there's more protons coming out, that bicarb will just bind that up super quickly, and that's a buffer. And so it happens like instantaneously pretty much. And so hemoglobin, also another one of those, if you remember, the hemoglobin, when this happens in the red blood cells, the hemoglobin binds that proton. And then bicarbonate, which I just talked about. And so there's also sodium bicarbonate, this reaction here, which is not, I don't make you know that much. But that's just another one. And you don't quite often have this in the body, right? Because we're not really injecting strong acids, but that's what would happen. Same with strong bases, which is the opposite. And so they're not as big of a deal as far as, because we're not ever going to have strong acids or strong bases being injected into our bodies. Phosphate buffer, so just phosphate that's around can act as a buffer too, because it's PO4 minus. And then proteins. So proteins are another bigger one, right? Because proteins have an amine group on them, so the NH3 minus, that can absorb a proton too. Yeah. So, but the big ones are going to be your bicarb as far as your buffer systems go. Respiratory system, so we talked about this one, right? You guys should know this one already. We'll review it in case you don't. And so this helps regulate so your proton levels, and so you have a sensor in your brain that can detect the increased CO2 levels, and that's going to increase your carbonic acid. Yeah, I got that. Which is going to increase the dissociation into this. And that's going to increase your proton, so it causes your decrease of pH and your all your body fluid. That stimulates in your brainstem, you have chemoreceptors that are going to be able to sense that change in pH, and they're going to tell your respiratory center in your brainstem to increase the rate and depth of breathing. Why? Because you're going to breathe out more carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is a source of acid. Always remember that. So you're going to be breathing out more carbon dioxide. Get it all out. You have too much acid around, get it out, get rid of it. And the respiratory system is very, very good at that. And that's going to change your pH of your body fluids, going to change it back to normal, and then that's going to stop the signal of the respiratory center, and so the respiratory rate will go back to normal. That's called negative feedback. There you go. So if you increase the rate and depth of breathing, it's going to decrease your acid level, your proton level, because you're exhaling it as CO2, which will increase your blood pH. The other way around, if you decrease the rate and depth of breathing, you're going to be holding on to more CO2. That's going to cause an increase in acid and decrease your blood pH. Yeah, pretty cool. The kidneys play a role too. So, but their role is much slower. If you think about it, increasing our rate and responding to that by breathing faster can happen pretty quickly. But getting the kidney to get rid of more acid or make more bicarb or make more acid takes a little bit longer, right? Because it takes some time for those fluids to get filtered through the kidney. So they can do that. Again, they can excrete more or less proton. I keep doing that, sorry, because my screen keeps going blank. Or they can, or bicarb as well, so they can either excrete more bicarb or put more bicarb back into the plasma. Okay, and this happens in all the tubules in the all the tubules within the kidney. Diet too, but I don't really know how much that plays, big of a role that plays at all. I don't know how much I agree with that on this. This is the human one, so maybe they know more about it than us animal guys do. So let's talk about acid-base imbalances. All right, let me erase this guy here. Okay, so normal pH 7.4, range 7.35 to 7.45. So if we go less than 7.35, got that? Yes. Then that is going to be acidosis, right? Because we're going lower. Okay, so there are two causes of acidosis. Because you can either be producing too much acid, that's going to be metabolic, or maybe you're producing the same amount of acid, but you're not able to get rid of it, right? So you can't, you're unable to exhale that CO2, which is our main way of being able to get rid of it. So that is called respiratory. I can't spell. Okay, so let's go. So in this, you have some levels. It shows you some levels of like what the pH is, what the partial pressure of CO2 is, what your bicarb is. Talks a lot about compensations. This human class that I taught, they made me go into their test questions were super duper hard because they always included the compensation in there too, which I don't do because it just kind of muddies the water and makes it really confusing, especially for a basic physiology class. So the reason you can have all these levels, and I don't do this for you guys, which maybe in future classes I will, is that because when you do blood gas, you can get all these values. And so when you do a blood gas, which is best to do an arterial blood gas, but that's not always that easy, but you can still get these values. So you'll get a pH, you'll get a PCO2 level, PO2 level, and bicarb. I can't remember what else. There might be some ions in there too. And so that's why I could give you like a blood gas and you tell me what is going on, because just from that blood gas, you'll be able to tell me if it's a respiratory acidosis and metabolic acidosis, or maybe the alkaloses as well. So because that's number one on here, let's talk about respiratory acidosis. So we're over here in respiratory land. So accumulation of CO2 can result from a variety of factors that hinder pulmonary ventilation. So anything that's going to keep your lungs from exhaling CO2 is a cause of respiratory acidosis. Pneumonia, lung cancer, pneumothorax, lung lobe torsion. All of these can result in a respiratory acidosis. Brain injury, coma, where your respiratory center is depressed. Any obstruction. These ones aren't as big. So anything that reduces gas exchange, again, pneumonia, emphysema, pneumothorax, some narcotic drugs, so anesthesia, for example, can all cause a respiratory acidosis. So any animal that is not able to exhale enough CO2. So the entities that reduce gas exchange are also going to possibly make the animal cyanotic because they're also not getting enough oxygen. So an animal with a respiratory acidosis, then, if the lungs are the problem, then the lungs can't compensate. They can't be the one that fixes this problem. So we are going to go to, the effects. Depressed central nervous system, so any kind of drowsiness, disorientation, labored breathing, cyanosis, like I said, for those obvious reasons. Labored breathing because they're going to be, because they have lung disease, so they're going to be either very labored breathing, or very quick, shallow breathing, depending. So the compensation for that, because it's a primary respiratory problem, your lungs aren't able to compensate for that, so that goes to your kidneys to compensate for that. So a respiratory problem is always compensated for by the kidneys. Okay, and if you remember, the kidneys is a much slower process for the kidneys to respond to that. So they'll reabsorb, they'll increase your absorption of bicarb, and they'll also make bicarb and put that into the plasma to help compensate for that. They can also increase the proton excretion at the distal tubule. This can take days, so it's not a very efficient way to do this. The respiratory acidoses are a little bit more dangerous. And so you can do this, you can treat this, you can improve ventilation, you can put them on a ventilator, which we do in animals, not as often as humans, of course. Bronchodilation will help, and just treating whatever is the primary cause. While the acidosis is important, if it's caused by lung disease, like I said, you're really going to probably be more concerned with their oxygen levels. That's a little bit more dangerous. Moving on, metabolic acidosis, one of the most common ones you will see. So it's a big one. That's why there's a lot of causes right here. So your pH is going to be low, the acidosis. Bicarb is going to be low because this is a primary metabolic problem. So I didn't talk about that for the respiratory one. What you'll see if you know if it's respiratory, it says your partial pressure of CO2 is going to be higher than normal. With this one, your bicarb is going to be low, and because it's busy buffering the acid that's being produced for whatever reason, your PCO2 can be normal or low. Again, I'm not going to ask you that in specific, so that's okay. So possible causes, so you could either have kidney disease that's not excreting the protons very well, or you're losing too much bicarb due to kidney disease. So any kind of prolonged vomiting of stomach, this is the key, stomach and upper intestinal contents. Because intestinal contents are very alkaline. When you're vomiting intestinal contents too, you know that because when animals vomit bile, it's yellowish or greenish in color, very foamy. So that's how you know they're vomiting bile. So any kind of prolonged vomiting, very chronic vomiting, because now you're losing all that source of base, causing metabolic acidosis. Again, I don't think that one's very common. Big one that you're going to see a ton of is diabetic ketoacidosis. So I talked about that one already. So diabetes mellitus, so all your fatty acid metabolism is going to cause ketone buildup in the blood. Okay, and the liver just can't handle it all, and that's going to cause acidosis. It's a big deal, super critical patients, and requires very intense treatment. Lactic acidosis, again, that is going to be the anaerobic respiration of glucose is going to cause your lactic acidosis. And then prolonged diarrhea, so a very chronic and prolonged severe diarrhea, because the intestinal contents at that point are alkaline, so you're going to lose all of that base from prolonged diarrhea. So what happens when you have a metabolic acidosis then? If you have a lot of acid being produced by the kidney, or not by the kidneys, by the body, then what's the quickest and most efficient way to get rid of that? Are the kidneys going to be your best way? Or maybe the respiratory system. So with all this extra acid in the body, then the respiratory center, that's going to trigger the respiratory center, increase the rate and depth of breathing. Wait, I said that one already, right? And that's going to help you get rid of all that CO2. So that's respiratory compensation. So an animal with a metabolic acidosis, you can quite often see them coming in panting. And so, which is tricky, right? Because you see an animal panting. Are they panting because they're excited? Because they have anxiety and they're nervous? Are they panting because they have lung disease? Or are they panting because they're acidotic? So there's so many reasons, and that's why that the panting and the increased respiratory rate is a big thing to try to monitor and try to figure out what the actual main cause is. So respiratory compensation, when you're increasing that rate, that's called hyperventilation. You're going to be blowing off all that acid as much as you can. And you can treat this with IV base, so bicarbonate or something. I haven't seen that done that often because usually you're trying to treat the cause of the acidosis. For like DKA, for example, the big important thing is to get that blood sugar under control. All right, so moving on to the alkaloses. We're going to go greater than 7.45. I have an eraser, I don't know why I'm using it. For okay. Oh, I lost my screen. Now I can't see. There we go. Okay. So greater than 7.45 is going to cause an alkalosis. And so these are not near as common, and nor are they near as critical as acidoses are. So you're going to have a pH of greater than 7.45. It can be caused, again, by metabolic or respiratory. So we'll start here because that's what next is on the paper, is a respiratory alkalosis. So a main cause of this is going to be hyperventilation. And so if you are exhaling too much CO2 because you're hyperventilating. So whether or not in humans, that's because of anxiety, and dogs because of panting. So dogs that are very high anxiety, very stressful in the clinic, for example, and they're constantly panting, then that can cause a respiratory alkalosis. Not that I'm saying it, I've just seen it. It happens. So that low blood CO2 can also living at high altitudes. That's more of a human thing than it is an animal thing, I think. But if any of you guys out there working in high altitude, you can let me know if that's a thing. And then, so again, more human reasons as far as musicians, singers, deep sea free divers that have prolonged very deep breathing can cause a respiratory alkalosis. And so that's because it's respiratory in nature. You're going to have metabolic compensation by the kidneys, and that, of course, as always, can take several days. And so they're going to excrete more bicarb. They can actually put more proton into the plasma as well. And so you can treat it by calming. If it's an animal and it's because of anxiety, then you can just give them some A's, calm them down, and then that will get the respiratory rate under control. Or you could raise the CO2 in the environment as well. Again, both of these alkaloses are things that I've never seen in person. You guys can let me know if any of you guys have ever seen alkalosis or any of your experiences. Put it up on the discussion board. So metabolic alkalosis, the last one. So you're either going to have too much loss of protons or retention of any basic substances. So the kidneys, they can do a little bit with that, or prolonged vomiting of stomach content. So when you're vomiting just stomach contents, then that means you're going to be losing a lot of acid. Now, typically with chronic prolonged vomiting, intestinal contents get in with that as well, which is also a reason why you don't see this one very often. And so your effects of that, so metabolic alkalosis. So you're not going to have enough acid, so your respiratory compensation for that would be to slow down breathing quite a lot. And you want to try to hold on to as much of that CO2 as you can as your source of acid. So hypoventilation, which is the decreased rate and depth of breathing. And that'll increase the pH of your body fluid. So treatment, usually none at all if you actually ever see it. I wonder how much in human medicine, how much they see in either of these alkaloses. Because I'm very curious because I've never seen them. Because you can give some kind of acidic medication to compensate for that as well. Hooray! I made it through the whole thing without being interrupted. So here is your video on acid base. Great. Thanks, guys.